Part 1. The Great Famine, 1315 to 1317. They called it the Great Famine. But famine doesn't scream. It doesn't march with banners or send out proclamations. It doesn't wear armor or fly flags. It seeps in, silent, cold, wet, and waits. Between the years 1315 and 1317, Europe was brought to its knees. Not by war, but by rain. Endless, merciless rain. Spring came late that year. The earth remained hard and frozen far longer than usual. When the soil finally softened, farmers rushed to plant their crops, but then, the skies opened. The rain didn't stop. For over 150 days, sheets of cold water pummeled the land. Fields became swamps. Seeds rotted in the mud. Wheat and barley never sprouted. Roads were submerged. Livestock drowned in pastures, or died from disease, their bloated corpses washing downstream. This wasn't just bad weather. This was a slow, relentless collapse. In England, chroniclers described carts of drowned sheep being dragged into villages. In northern France, fields that once fed entire towns lay useless. In the Holy Roman Empire, the Rhine overflowed, washing away crops, bridges, and entire villages. And across it all, hunger. Real, gnawing, body-consuming hunger. People first turned to their reserves. Then, to their animals. When the animals were gone, they turned to tree bark, grass, roots, leather, anything that might dull the pain clawing in their stomachs. In the Low Countries, what is today Belgium and the Netherlands, some ground up ferns and moss to make a kind of mush. In Germany, dried dung was mixed with herbs in desperate attempts to create bread. It was not enough. By the winter of 1315, the first waves of death rolled across Europe. Children perished first, then the elderly, then the strong. No one was spared. Cities, towns, hamlets, all starved alike. Estimates vary, but most historians agree. At least 10% of Europe's population died. Some believe it was as high as 25% in certain regions. In a world without modern medicine, where people lived already on the brink of survival, famine was not just a shortage, it was an erasure. Entire family lines vanished. Entire villages disappeared. Monasteries, usually places of refuge, became morgues. In England, monks recorded the deaths of 15,000 people in one abbey alone. In France, priests performed mass burials in fields, blessing dozens of corpses at once. There was no time for funerals. The economic system collapsed. Grain prices quadrupled. In some towns, bread cost the equivalent of a week's wages. Many simply stopped working. What was the point of money when there was nothing to buy? And then came the disease. Weakened by hunger, people became easy prey for sickness. Dysentery spread in wet villages. Insects bred in flooded homes. Typhus, pneumonia, and influenza joined the famine like silent executioners. In Ireland, rain washed away entire communities. In Germany, entire forests were cut down for firewood and foraged to nothing. In Hungary, men killed each other over moldy loaves. In Bruges, parents abandoned children on church steps. In some Italian cities, desperate people attempted to migrate south, only to find famine had beaten them there. In Poland, people dug up graves to steal clothing. In the Swiss Alps, avalanches and landslides, caused by water-saturated ground, wiped out entire paths of escape. Yet through all this, the rain continued. What made the Great Famine unique was not just its scale, it was its relentlessness. Every time people thought it might end, another season brought more storms. Another planting season wasted. Another harvest failed. People began to speak of divine punishment. The church offered explanations. Sin, corruption, a test of faith. Priests held processions through mud-caked streets, urging people to repent, but repentance brought no sun. Many began to lose faith. In some places, nobles fled their estates, leaving serfs to fend for themselves. In others, local lords enforced brutal order, hoarding what little food they had in guarded manors. And in the shadows, something darker stirred. Desperation turned to madness. Stories began to circulate, stories that no one wanted to believe, but everyone heard. In a remote village in the Alps, a family was said to have boiled a traveler's body. In parts of Denmark, children went missing and were never found. These were dismissed as rumors, until they weren't. In one recorded case in the region of Styria, present-day Austria, a widow and her 2 children were discovered eating human remains. She did not deny it. She did not cry. She simply said, "They were already dead, and my babies were still alive." What do you do with that kind of horror? What do you say? The villagers said nothing. They let her go. And in doing so, something changed. Something fundamental. The line between right and wrong. The moral compass forged by religion, law, and society, twisted. Because when food disappears, civilization begins to rot too. And that is where our story truly begins. It does not begin with war, or conquest, or revolution. It begins with hunger, unrelenting, inescapable, and it ends in silence. Part 2. The Styria Incident, 1316. It was the kind of village you'd forget on a map. No walls, no castle, just scattered huts, a church with a cracked bell, and a dirt road that had turned to sludge. The land belonged to a minor noble who hadn't been seen in months. The priest had stopped holding mass. The gravedigger was the last one to die, which meant the dead stayed where they fell. Styria, deep in the heart of what is now Austria, was drowning in the same misery as the rest of Europe. But something happened here that would set it apart forever. A horror so intimate and so quiet. It nearly disappeared from history. It began with a smell. Not the stench of rot. Everyone was used to that. It was something else, a scent of cooked flesh, carried by the breeze one damp evening in the fall of 1316. Familiar, but wrong. The widow's name has been lost. So has the name of her village. All we know comes from the pages of a Franciscan monk's hidden journal, found centuries later, sealed in the wall of a monastery. She had 5 children. By the end of summer, 2 were dead. No one had seen her weep. She didn't beg for food. She didn't try to trade. She stayed in her collapsing hut with her remaining children and kept the chimney smoking. People noticed. They wondered, what could she possibly be cooking? Where did she get it? There hadn't been meat in the village for months. That night, a farmer named Lucas crept to her home. He'd lost everything, wife, son, even his dog. He told himself he wanted to ask for help. In truth, he wanted to steal whatever she had. What he saw through the window froze him in place. Her children were eating, quietly, slowly, a thin broth, with floating chunks of something pale. Then he saw her, kneeling by the hearth, stirring with a long wooden spoon. She leaned in, fished something out, and set it on a plate. It was a hand. Lucas ran. By morning, the entire village had gathered outside her hut. No one wanted to knock, but the door was already open. Inside, they found her cooking, the stew still bubbling, bones stacked in the corner. Human bones. She looked up at them. Not ashamed, not angry, just tired. "I didn't kill them," she said. "They were already gone. I couldn't bury them, and I couldn't let my babies die too." The villagers were silent. No one asked for names. No one checked the bones. They all knew who had died. They had all walked past the same corpses every day. They left, one by one. No trial, no priest, no judgment. The widow was never spoken of again. But the silence she left behind would fester. Because the truth was not just that she ate the dead. It was that the village let her. Because they understood. Because they might have done the same. Because maybe, they already had. The Journal of Brother Matthias, the Franciscan monk who recorded the incident, was never intended to be read. He made that clear in the margins. Notes scrawled in haste. Passages scratched out violently. Entire pages missing. And yet, what remains is chilling. According to Brother Matthias, the woman was not alone. He writes of other suspicions. though he uses coded language. The butcher's wife appears multiple times, as does the baker's son, though their names are never revealed. He describes smoke rising from chimneys long after food stores were known to be empty. He notes that livestock had vanished months earlier, yet certain homes still smelled of stew. More disturbingly, he writes of confessions, whispers in the dark, villagers visiting him late at night, trembling, not for forgiveness, but for silence. Men and women alike, describing things they'd never imagined they were capable of. "I buried my mother," one man reportedly told him, "then dug her up again. I didn't mean to. I waited until the cold had kept her well. I thought I would just look. But when I opened her mouth, she looked so peaceful, so willing." These were not murders. These were not crimes of violence. They were acts of hunger, acts of desperation, but they left behind something worse than guilt. Shame. The village began to unravel. Children no longer played. Neighbors stopped speaking. The church stood empty. When a man died, he was buried without ceremony. When a child vanished, no one asked where she went. Brother Matthias noted that even he began to falter. He questioned his vows. He stopped writing for weeks at a time. His penmanship grew erratic, his prayers fragmented. And then, one night, he made a final entry. "I too have tasted what should not be tasted. I know now that I am damned. But the silence is worse." That was the last line in the journal. No further records exist. No one knows what became of the village. But similar stories began to surface elsewhere. In the Netherlands, a merchant's diary described finding a child roasting over an open fire. In Poland, soldiers discovered a farmhouse where bones had been bleached and carved into tools. In France, rumors spread of a white stew served in times of extreme hunger, though no one ever admitted what it was made from. The church began quietly collecting these stories. In 1318, a letter from an archbishop to the pope warned of moral collapse in the outer provinces and urged immediate action. But what could be done? The rain still fell. The hunger had not ended. So the church did what institutions often do when faced with the unbearable. It erased. Confessions were burned, journals confiscated, priests reassigned, monasteries sealed their archives, and those who had survived were encouraged to forget or face excommunication. In some places, they were threatened. In others, they needed no threat, because those who had lived through the famine did not want to remember. The widow of Styria became a myth, a warning, a whisper told to children who refused to eat, "Don't waste food, or you'll end up like the woman who ate her neighbors." But behind the story, something real remained, a truth that could not be spoken, but never quite disappeared. And now, centuries later, we find ourselves drawn back to that silence. Because it forces us to ask a question we'd rather avoid. If it were us, would we have done the same? And if the answer is yes, what does that make us? Part 3. The Mother of Flanders. She lived in a cottage at the edge of the woods, where the land folded into itself and the wind never stopped howling through the trees. Her name, like so many others in that cursed time, has been lost to history. But what remains is her final sentence, recorded by a man who wished he'd never heard it. "I didn't want to lose everything." This is what she said when they found the bones. It was Flanders, 1317. The rain had finally stopped, but the world it left behind was gray, waterlogged, and quiet. Crops had drowned, markets were bare, a loaf of bread, if one could be found, cost more than a laborer earned in a month. Children died with open eyes. Parents buried them in shallow graves, then left flowers made of straw. Her husband had died in December, one of the last to fall in their village. He'd been strong, a cooper by trade. His hands were rough with calluses, his back bent from barrels. But strength meant little in a world where food had vanished. They had one son. He was 5, thin, sickly, with blonde curls matted by weeks of fever. After her husband died, the woman vanished from the village square. No one saw her at the church. No one saw smoke from her chimney. Neighbors assumed she had died too, or was about to. Then one morning, the chimney coughed smoke. 2 days later, she was seen walking to the stream, carrying a bucket, steady, not stumbling. Her eyes were sunken, but not crazed. Her limbs gaunt, but not trembling. And that night, a smell drifted from her home. One of the local men, a blacksmith named Renier, followed the scent. He was hungry, like everyone else. His daughter had died the week before, and his grief had twisted into something bitter. He approached the house in the dark, stood under the eaves, and peered through a crack in the shutter. He saw her stirring a pot over the fire. She ladled broth into a wooden bowl, set it on the table, sat across from no one. Renier knocked. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised. She invited him in. The fire flickered. The pot bubbled. A single candle lit the table. "Sit," she said. He did. She poured him a bowl. He sniffed it. It smelled rich, unbelievably so, a depth of flavor that hadn't been tasted in months. He asked what it was. She looked at him, and then she said, "I didn't want to lose everything." He didn't eat. He left. Word spread. By dawn, the village had gathered. Inside her home, they found bones, small, fragile, a child's. The skull was gone, the jaw missing, but a shoe sat near the hearth, tiny, worn through at the toe. She didn't deny anything. "My son was dying," she said. "He was crying all night. I couldn't stop it. The sound of him going. It broke something in me. When he finally went still, I couldn't let him go." She looked at the villagers. "Don't make me say it again." No one did. There was no priest, no constable, no punishment. They buried what was left of the boy. They left her house untouched. She remained there, alone. No one ever spoke to her again. Weeks passed. The famine waned. Slowly, grain shipments from distant regions arrived. The rain retreated. Green returned to the fields. But in the village of Flanders, the green did not bring joy. Children no longer sang. Mothers held their infants tighter. Fathers built fences higher. She died in the spring. Some said it was poison. Others believed she simply stopped breathing. They buried her beside her husband, not beside her son, and they never marked the grave. Years later, a monk traveling through the region recorded the story. He did not use names. He wrote only this: "In a time when death ruled the earth, some sought to preserve life in ways the living could not forgive. One woman fed herself with memory, and died with nothing but silence. Centuries passed. The famine became a paragraph in history books. But in Flanders, mothers sometimes whispered to their children when they refused to eat, 'You eat what you're given, or you'll go hungry like the woman who lost her world, spoonful by spoonful.' And in that, her story lived on, not as a tale of horror, but as a shadow of desperation, a warning, a question. What would you do if it meant keeping someone you loved just a little bit longer? And when the bowl is empty, and the child is gone, what is left of you?" Part 4. The Wall of Silence. They knew. That was the truth no one ever said out loud. The villagers in Styria, the farmers in Flanders, the friars in forgotten parishes. They all knew. They heard the rumors, saw the signs, smelled the smoke, and they said nothing. The question has haunted historians for centuries. Why didn't anyone speak? The answer is neither simple nor comfortable. It begins with fear. In 14th century Europe, morality was enforced not just by law, but by heaven. The church was the final authority on sin, on justice, on death. To be excommunicated was not just to be cut off from society. It was to be denied salvation. To die outside the church was to be buried in unholy ground. Your name stricken from memory. Eternal damnation. And cannibalism? It was the ultimate blasphemy. A crime not only against man, but against God. A reversal of creation itself. If you confessed, you were damned. If you were caught, you were executed. And not cleanly. Burned, torn, displayed. But what if everyone already knew? What if the act itself was unspeakable, but the silence was shared? This was the second reason no one spoke. Guilt. In villages where corpses lay unburied, where children cried themselves to sleep on empty stomachs, morality bent, not all the way, not openly, but enough to survive one more day. There is evidence, scattered, partial, often buried under layers of revision, that communities entered into a kind of mutual forgetting. A collective decision to unremember, to erase. In the town of Mersch, near modern-day Luxembourg, a record from 1318 shows a priest refusing to give last rites to a family he accused of hiding rot in their cellar. The priest vanished 2 weeks later. The church claimed he drowned. His journal was never recovered, but a letter sent by a neighboring monk hints at something darker. The tongue that names what must not be named risks being silenced by those who have no tongues left to lose. In the Alpine village of Sass, a folkloric song survived until the 17th century. Its lyrics were cryptic, but one line stood out. We eat and pray in quiet ways, lest hunger take the rest. When the church heard of the song, it was banned. Copies of it were burned. But the melody survived, hummed by shepherds in secret. Silence became survival. Children were told never to ask about missing siblings. Women who had lost entire families were never questioned. Men who returned from hunting trips empty-handed but strangely full-bellied were avoided. Not accused. It was a form of social triage. To point a finger was to open a wound everyone shared. Better to bind it in silence. Even the church, despite its public condemnation of sin, participated in this forgetting. Bishops wrote angry letters, but rarely were inquisitors sent. Rarely were trials held. When they were, it was months later, when the evidence was gone, when the accused had died or disappeared. And even then, the charges were vague, violations of the natural order, unspeakable acts, never the word itself, cannibalism. To name it was to give it power. And so they buried it, not just in graves, but in memory. This silence lasted generations. In 1348, when the Black Death arrived, new horrors replaced the old. The famine became a distant shadow. Survivors aged, children forgot, stories turned into whispers, whispers into nothing. But trauma doesn't vanish, it sinks. In the late 1500s, a Jesuit missionary in Germany wrote of a village where no one ate pork. Despite raising pigs, when asked why, they shrugged. It's not for us, they said. We remember other meat. In a convent outside Bruges, a nun reportedly screamed every time someone boiled bones for soup. She had no memory of why. In Italy, a woodcut from 1622 shows a mother shielding her child not from a beast, but from a pot. The Great Famine never ended. It simply went silent, and that silence, deep, ancestral, shrouded in shame, passed from mouth to mouth like a ghost. Today, historians find fragments, annotations in the margins, edits in ledgers, gaps in birth records. They find them and wonder, was this the site of a feast? Or a forgetting? Because what began as an act of survival became something else entirely. A pact, not signed, not spoken, but sealed with hunger, with shame, and with the unbearable knowledge that under the right conditions, any of us could do the same. And once you know that, what's left to say? Part 5. The Church's Cleansing Fire. In the corridors of power, within cathedrals of stone and castles of marble, news traveled slower, but no less urgently. The noble families, the bishops, the cardinals, and the papal legates all heard the whispers. Whispers of horror, of mothers eating children, of graves disturbed, of soup with no name. It reached them not through proclamations or testimonies, but through silence. Letters from local abbots grew shorter. Monastic records blurred into ambiguity. Parish reports omitted entire villages, replacing facts with phrases like, withdrawn into sorrow, or, beset by unnamed sin. What they feared more than the act itself, more than cannibalism, was the implication. Because to acknowledge the unspeakable meant admitting that the system had failed. The feudal order depended on divine hierarchy. Kings ruled by the grace of God. Bishops shepherded souls through divine authority. If people were eating one another under their care, what did that say about that authority? The church and the aristocracy faced a dilemma more dangerous than heresy. They faced the mirror, and they chose to look away. Some bishops demanded investigations, but most were blocked. Cardinals in Avignon, where the papacy resided during the early 14th century, issued discreet instructions: eliminate rumors, rewrite accounts, preserve stability. A set of internal church memos, discovered in a sealed chest in Avignon centuries later, reveals chilling clarity. If the shepherd admits the flock has turned to wolves, the field becomes the forest. Suffering is a test. Judgment lies with heaven, not man. Where there is no record, there is no memory. Where there is no memory, there is no stain. Thus began what historians now call the cleansing fire, not a literal blaze, but a spiritual one, a purge of paper, of memory, of witness. In 1320, over 1.200 monastic volumes were recalled under the guise of doctrinal correction. Many never returned. Monasteries were ordered to consolidate parish records. In practice, this meant removal, entire pages excised, rewritten, or drowned in ink. Local lords followed suit. Tax records were amended. Death tolls reclassified. Villages that disappeared were explained away as abandoned due to pestilence. Families erased. Names removed from lineage charts. Even architecture bore the mark. Chapels where mass burials occurred were deconsecrated, torn down, and rebuilt atop new foundations. Stones from one such site in Rouen were used to construct a bell tower. Its bells tolled each day over a town that no longer remembered why its square was so wide, so flat, so eerily empty. And yet, beneath the silence, truth flickered. One inquisitor, Father Corbin of Anjou, ignored orders. He kept meticulous private notes, hidden beneath floorboards of his rectory. In them, he describes a village where 30 children disappeared. A lone woman survived. When he confronted her, she fell to her knees and begged, "Let me be forgotten." Corbin wrote, "Her eyes were not mad. They were empty, like lamps that had burned too long. I did not absolve her, but I did not condemn her." What would you have done, Corbin, if your hands had no wheat to touch, your mouth no word to speak? These writings were never published. Corbin was found dead in 1323. The cause? Exposure. But the floorboards beneath his home remained intact, until 1908. When a construction crew uncovered the box, within lay a letter never sent. To acknowledge them is to break the world. To forget them is to become beasts. So I will remember. In silence. It was signed simply, C. And so it went. The nobility commissioned paintings of plenty. The church held festivals of rebirth. Markets reopened. Fields were replanted. A new narrative emerged. One of resilience, of divine mercy, of rebounding strength. But in the margins of these celebrations, artists painted strange things. A feast with one chair left empty. A child reaching into a cauldron. A priest burying a skull wrapped in cloth. Allegory, they said. Symbolism, nothing more. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Centuries later, scholars would return to those fields. Archaeologists found unmarked graves, some shallow, some with cut marks on bones inconsistent with burial rites. Anthropologists interviewed villagers who swore their ancestors once boiled rainwater for meat that never came. And in the libraries of Rome, in the quietest corners, theologians would stumble across blackened pages, burned at the edges, but not entirely gone. Accounts of Eucharist inverted, of hunger stronger than Scripture, of flesh consumed not as sacrament, but as sorrow. These were not accusations, they were elegies. The cleansing fire had scorched the memory but failed to kill the truth. It lingered in lullabies, in broken frescoes, in the absences within family trees. Because some stains do not fade, some fires purify. Others only illuminate what we dare not see. And when the world returns to order, when the church rings its bells and the nobility reclaims its throne, what remains in the silence between the chimes? The memory of what was done, the refusal to speak of it, and the echo of a question still unanswered. If your world collapsed, your child weeping in your arms, the sky black with rain, what would you be willing to forget in order to survive? Part 6. The last lesson. When a society reaches the edge of collapse, it does not fall like a tower, it melts like ice. Slowly, quietly, piece by piece, until one day, what remains is unrecognizable. So it was with Europe during the Great Famine. Fields rotted, families vanished, faiths faltered, but the most devastating loss was not crops, or cattle, or even life. It was silence. Silence in the face of the unthinkable. Silence wrapped around campfires. Silence in stone churches. Silence passed from parent to child. Why? Because the truth was unbearable. That the social contract, written in scripture and law, was, at its core, conditional, and when food disappeared, so did civilization. The lesson of 1315 to 1317 is not about cannibalism. It is about what people become when they are forced to choose between death and damnation, between morality and survival, and what is most terrifying, that many chose to survive. We like to imagine that catastrophe brings out the best in us, that in our darkest hour, we rise together, but history does not always bear this out. In the famine villages, people stopped being neighbors. They became competitors, witnesses, liabilities, and ultimately, secrets. The few who committed the most taboo acts were not alone. They were surrounded by others who saw, who knew, and who said nothing. That is the true horror, not the act, but the quiet that followed. Because silence is not neutral. It is not passive. It is a choice, a shield, a weapon. When enough people choose not to speak, the unspeakable becomes tradition. Centuries after the famine, the descendants of those villages would sing songs with missing verses, paint murals with one corner forever blank, bury bones in gardens and call them rocks. They did not forget. They remembered exactly enough to know what not to say. And in this, we see the greatest transformation of all. Not the loss of life, but the loss of voice, the reshaping of memory itself. There were scholars who claimed the famine birthed modern Europe, that it shattered the feudal order, that it paved the way for reform, renaissance, revolution. But at what cost? The cost was the acceptance of silence as policy, as virtue, as wisdom. We see it even today, in the stories we avoid, the histories we sanitize, the truths we refuse to name. And so the lesson of the famine endures, not as a relic, but as a mirror. When crisis strikes, we will be asked again, who will we protect? Who will we become? And what will we allow ourselves to forget, just to sleep at night? This is not just a history. It is a warning. The famine is over, but the silence remains.